As I said at the beginning of our service, I'm excited to invite Tim to be our preacher. So come up higher, brother. Jesus told me to invite you on up, so here we go.
Thank you, Jason, and I do have a small admission. It was a few weeks ago, we were in the back, and Jason was up here preaching, and Ruth decided to also start preaching a sermon in the back. Hannah leans over.
Next Sunday.
Yeah. She'll be up at the podium in no time. But Hannah leaned over and said, Tim, this is probably pretty tough for Jason to preach with all this talking going on. I'll take Ruth downstairs. And I said, well, Hannah, it probably is pretty tough for Jason, but don't you think he could use the challenge? And of course, not a week later, Jason invites me to preach, so I might have something coming to me during this sermon. Well deserved. Thank you, Ruth. But I also appreciate being a part of a worshiping community that is taking the time to talk about this important topic and the upcoming International Overdose Awareness Day. Our latest 12-month estimate is 109,000 dead from overdoses. And looking forward, the closest estimates right now are 1 million more dead by the end of this decade. And so chances are, if it's not you knowing someone who has died from an overdose, you know someone who has loved someone who has died from a drug overdose. And sadly, this is not a problem that's just going to go away tomorrow. And some of you have heard pieces of my own story of a struggle with the opioid use disorder. But I'd like to start this morning by sharing the story of another. His name's Mark Ji Xingjiang. He lived at the turn of the last century in a village in northern China and was a physician. He was a devout Catholic, and he was the one who was known in the community that if you couldn't afford health care, you went to Mark. He would be the one to help you out. And he also had some issues with indigestion. And he did what was common at the time, was to use opium to help with that problem. But what he soon discovered was something that I had also discovered in my own life, was that what was beginning as a medicine and helping with health soon became a poison that he felt like he could no longer control. And so each week he went to confession and he told his priest that he was unable to stop using opium. And week after week he went to this priest, and eventually the priest said, if you haven't stopped by now, you must not really want to. And if you don't really want to, then I believe you are unrepentant and you can no longer participate in the Eucharist. And so for 30 years, this physician continued to attend every week, only to be denied full participation in that worshiping community. And I have to wonder what was going through that priest's head. Did he think something like this passage in Jeremiah and look out at Mark and other people who were using drugs and dismiss them by saying they are pursuing that which is worthless, and so have become worthless themselves? Now, one thing I love about this community, too, is I don't think I need to spend the entire time of this sermon telling you that that's the wrong take. And that, in fact, I love being at a church that when our priest says all are welcome at this table, he means all are welcome. And if there was any hint of denying someone communion for something like that, I think there'd be a small uprising in the pews with people saying, not in my church. What I'd like to do today, something learned from Rabbi Abraham Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the last century, and his book on the prophets was fantastic, not just because he talked about what was going on at the time or the context in which the words were written, but how he invites us into the text of the prophets, to see ourselves in these words in a variety of ways and to be creative and fully immersing ourselves in what these words might have to say to us today. And so to start with that, I think if there's ever a time when we read the prophets and we pat ourselves on the back that they must be talking about someone else, we're doing it wrong. And so as I've sat with this text, the place that I wanted to start with how these words of Jeremiah have convicted me. And that's where I want to confess to you that there are times that I empathize with that priest. Hannah and I and Ruth, we live in downtown Manchester. We're not 50 yards away from New Horizons, our primary homeless shelter. And we have a lot of neighbors who use drugs. We have a lot of neighbors who have a substance use disorder. We have a lot of neighbors who are unhoused. And it is not uncommon to walk out our front or back door to see someone injecting drugs, or to hear things that we would rather Ruth not have to hear or see, or to have to clean up things that I would rather not have to clean up. And I would be lying to you if I told you I never felt a sense of anger. If I never felt a sense of frustration. If I never had in the back of my head, I quit, why can't you? And that's where I hear these words of Jeremiah to me. Anytime that I look at a homeless encampment, and my first thoughts about the value of my home, and not the fact that my neighbors don't have a home. That these words of Jeremiah are to me anytime I look at one of my neighbors and I think about being inconvenienced more than I think about the fact that they are created with infinite love and worth. Because the prophets, they're not just concerned with what is said on a Sunday morning. And they aren't even just concerned with me getting the right policy position, even though policy is important. What the prophets are calling to us to do is a reorientation of how we see the world. That we see that infinite worth in everyone around us. And when we fail to do that, we lose some of our worth ourselves. And what's also clear with Jeremiah is that being angry is not always a bad thing. And a spiritual director once told me, Tim, at the heart of all anger is either fear or sadness. And when you feel that anger, don't push it down, don't pretend it's not there. Hold it close, get to know it. And if you find yourself in a place in getting to know your own anger where you find you can make a choice between fear and sadness, choose sadness. Because it is sadness that allows us to see that something is not right with the world. Sadness is rooted in a love for the other, in a love for creation around us, because we know things can and should be better and different. And Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. And so when we hear some of these words that sound pretty angry, we know that it's an anger soaked in tears. Because Jeremiah can see so clearly that things could be different, things could be better, that the worth that we all have is not always present, not always recognized. And so I know some people here today might know someone who struggled with a substance use disorder, and maybe you've been hurt by someone. And maybe you felt that sense of anger, so I invite you to sit with that anger. And to, like Jeremiah, find that sadness in knowing that the world could be different, that the world could be better. And as we are changed by these words of Jeremiah, the second step I'd like to take is to imagine ourselves as Jeremiah, as the prophet, speaking to those in power, speaking to those who do not see that the world could be a different place. To see, I brought you into a plentiful land, to eat its fruits and its good things, but when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. The priests did not say, where is the Lord? Those who handle the law did not know me. Those who handle the law. We've all kind of had a crash course in epidemiology since this pandemic has started. And one of the interesting things that I learned early on about epidemics is when our scientists look at this, they look at it from two different ways. One is there a new or novel pathogen that is able to spread that people aren't prepared for? And that's what we had happen with COVID-19. It was a new and novel coronavirus, and it spread across the world. But the other way to look at it is to ask, is there a new vulnerability in the population that means an existing pathogen is able to wreak havoc? And it's important to understand right now that we have an overdose epidemic, not a pandemic. This is not happening in the same way across the world. Some in Canada, but this is mostly a phenomenon in the United States. Because what we are seeing today is not just the introduction of a new or novel pathogen. Fentanyl is part of 70% of these overdoses, and it's been around since the 1950s. Opium has been with humans as long as we've had recorded history. It is not the fact that there is a drug around, it is the fact that we are uniquely vulnerable because of our policies, because of our culture. It is because people who need mental health care get shackled. People who need health care and homes end up in cages for what they put inside their bodies. It is a culture that has decided to punish and want to see others suffer more than they are healed. We have a unique crisis in the United States today because of our policies. And my friends, I hope we are angry about those 109,000 deaths in just 12 months. I hope we are angry about the million lives that are going to be lost in these coming years. I hope we can say with the prophet Jeremiah, be appalled, O heavens, at this, be shocked, be utterly desolate. Because we have a racist war on drugs that was never a war on drugs, it was a war on people. And it has created this overdose crisis that we face today. Finally, I want to imagine Mark Xi Jinping as the prophet Jeremiah. If Mark was here today stepping into the role of Jeremiah, what would he have to say to all of us? Because his story did not end just with 30 years of being denied the Eucharist. The turn of the century, there was the Boxer Rebellion. It was an anti-Western movement, holding in memory, of course, the Opium Wars, in which the British Empire fought a violent battle against the Chinese people to force the importation of opium for their own profit. But when this Boxer Rebellion came to Mark's village, they rounded up all the Christians and said that they needed to recant their faith or die. Now I wonder what everyone thought Mark would do. Mark was known as the person who could not stop using opium. Maybe they thought he would be weak, first to turn. Well, today, Mark is known as Saint Mark Xi Jinping, because he made one request of his captors. He said, "Please, would you kill me last, so that none of my brothers and sisters in Christ need to die alone." The man who had for 30 years been denied full participation, when he looked around, his heart had been so transformed by the sacrament he had been denied that he was able to embody that life-giving energy that focused on the needs and comfort of those around him, even while facing his own death. I have to wonder if Mark ever felt angry at that priest for denying him the Eucharist. If he ever felt a sense of anger at the injustice of being denied that full participation. But I know that if he did feel that anger, it was an anger rooted in sadness. It was an anger rooted in those tears because he could see something different. He could see that those around him had forsaken the fountain of living water and dug out cisterns for themselves, cracked cisterns that could hold no water, while he was calling others to go straight to that fountain of living water, not to hold it back with our own cracked structures, but to let that love, to let that water, that healing water, flow. So as we come to this table today, a table where all are welcome, may our hearts be pierced with the words of Jeremiah as we learn to see the world and our neighbor the way God sees us, with infinite worth. May we be transformed by the anger of a weeping prophet who called lawmakers to account for defiling the land. And may we be inspired by St. Mark, who reminds us of the living water, and that his persistence, in spite of negative consequences, both his addiction and his faith were not so far apart. And that maybe it was his persistence all those years that brought him to a place where he could do what he did at the end of his life. And that he was a saint not in spite of his addiction, but he became a saint in some way because of his addiction. And may he remind us all that as we may be entertaining angels unawares, that there may be prophets and saints who are sleeping on our streets tonight that have the words and the message we need to be transformed. Amen.